What if everything you think you know about ancient Hindu temples is only the surface of a far deeper and darker spiritual machinery? What if behind their serene walls, their carved deities and their sacred chants, there existed a hidden system designed not only to elevate the chosen, but to punish those who were expelled from the divine path? This is the question that forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. What did the temples do to the devotees they rejected? And why were these actions kept in the shadows even from those who guarded the sanctuaries? Imagine being a devotee who spent years offering prayers, fasting during sacred cycles, and serving at the feet of the gods. One single mistake, one accusation, or even one political shift within the inner priesthood could redefine your destiny. In the ancient world, being expelled from a temple was not simply a spiritual penalty. It was a complete rupture of identity, community, and cosmic belonging. The society around these temples believed that divine favor flowed through the priests, so to be rejected by them meant to fall into a void where your past devotion no longer protected you and your future no longer belonged to you. But what exactly happened after this expulsion? Legends whisper about corridors where forbidden rites were carried out far from the public eye. Oral traditions speak of rituals meant to spiritually strip the expelled devotee, as if removing a mark the gods had once granted. Some accounts even suggest that the sacred guardians themselves feared the consequences of these practices, believing that certain punishments were so severe that not even the deities would look upon them. This raises a disturbing possibility. Were these temples simply places of worship, or were they centers of control where spiritual authority could reshape human fate with terrifying precision? The deeper you look, the more the fragments of history start to paint a chilling picture of a world where moral, religious, and political power blended into something capable of transforming a devotee into an outcast in a single moment. And if that possibility unsettles you, stay with the thought, because what you are about to uncover reaches far beyond the stories carved in stone. Before we move forward, tell me what you think so far. Have you ever imagined that a temple could hold this kind of hidden influence? Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Make sure to like this video and check if you are subscribed so you do not miss what comes next. What you will discover ahead may surprise you, and it helps a lot when you interact. Now let us keep moving as we approach the layers that were never meant to be revealed. Once a devotee was expelled, the hierarchy within the temple dictated the next steps, and these were far from arbitrary. The sacred guardians, individuals whose loyalty to the gods was intertwined with rigid protocol, assumed the responsibility of enforcing rules that extended beyond the visible. Their roles were not only ceremonial, but judicial, and in many cases, these guardians acted as the executioners of the temple's hidden ordinances. What makes this hierarchy so chilling is the way it was structured to ensure obedience through fear and mystique. Every guardian, high priest, or assistant priest was part of a web that monitored, judged, and ultimately decided the fate of those considered impure or disloyal. The expulsion was not the end, but the beginning of a journey that few survived unscathed. Once removed from the inner sanctum, expelled devotees were subjected to a combination of ritualized shaming and spiritual isolation. Accounts, often whispered in local folklore, describe how these individuals were required to undertake pilgrimages that seemed like acts of devotion, but were actually designed to break their spirit. They were sent to peripheral temple complexes or distant sacred sites where conditions were harsh, water scarce, and supervision strict. Every action, every chant, every gesture was meticulously observed. The guardians believed that neglecting even the smallest detail could anger the gods, and the expelled were constantly reminded of the divine judgment looming over them. Physical punishments, though rarely public, were applied with precise rules. Devotees could be bound in ceremonial chains, not merely for containment, but as symbols of their spiritual failure. They were subjected to fasting cycles far beyond normal, religious observance, hours spent in extreme silence and meditation that blurred the line between penance and torture. Their every day was dictated by the temple calendar, each hour a reminder of the power they had lost. Yet, the guardians never acted without ritual justification. Everything was framed as a divine mandate, preserving the sanctity of the temple while enforcing terror. Psychological manipulation was equally sophisticated. Expelled devotees were forced to witness the ongoing rituals they could no longer participate in, to see others receive blessings while they themselves were denied. This enforced separation created a deep sense of alienation, which compounded the effects of physical trials. In some cases, they were made to chant prayers for the very deities who had ostensibly rejected them, a cruel exercise in obedience that reinforced their subjugation and internalized guilt. The guardians recorded these sessions meticulously, noting the smallest deviations in compliance. Any perceived failure could trigger extended cycles of punishment, extending months or even years. Through this intricate system, the temple ensured that being expelled was not just a social or spiritual stigma, but a life-altering transformation that echoed through every interaction, every step the devotee took outside the temple walls. It was a complete restructuring of reality, making the expelled entirely dependent on the temple's interpretation of divine justice for any hope of restoration. These practices reveal that the power of the temple extended far beyond architecture, ceremony, or spiritual guidance. It was an instrument of control, a mechanism for ensuring obedience to a hierarchy that few dared question. The expelled learned that survival required understanding the invisible rules, the subtle signals of favor and disfavor, and the calculated distance maintained by the sacred guardians. Those who failed to navigate this web risked complete erasure from the community, both socially and spiritually, often fading into obscurity without any record of their devotion. This was the true authority of the temples, exercised silently, deliberately, and ruthlessly. Beyond the visible punishment and ritual isolation, the expelled devotees often faced the most insidious form of control: the manipulation of belief itself. The sacred guardians, steeped in ancient knowledge, understood that the mind could be as vulnerable as the body. They leveraged sacred texts, oral traditions, and the weight of centuries of spiritual authority to instill doubt and fear. Every lesson once meant to elevate a devotee now became a tool for condemnation. Each parable, each story of divine favor or wrath, reframed to justify their suffering. The expelled were made to question not only their actions, but their very worthiness in the eyes of the gods. In many cases, the temples employed a system of psychological tests disguised as spiritual exercises. Devotees were instructed to meditate in total darkness, often in chambers beneath the temple, where the only sound was the echo of their own heartbeat and the distant chanting of rituals they could no longer participate in. These exercises, ostensibly designed to purify the spirit, were in reality a method of breaking the mind gradually, of conditioning obedience through fear and isolation. Over weeks and months, the boundaries between devotion and subjugation blurred, and the expelled internalized the temple's judgment as if it were divine law itself. Social control extended beyond the temple walls. Families and communities were subtly coerced into enforcing the temple's sanctions. Friends and relatives who offered aid to the expelled could face ostracism, forced contributions to rituals, or even temporary banishment. The temple's influence reached into every corner of the devotees' world, turning allies into instruments of punishment. In this way, the guardians ensured that expulsion created not only spiritual and psychological suffering, but social isolation, amplifying the impact of the temple's hidden authority. The rituals themselves were layered with symbolism, each act reinforcing a hierarchy that placed the sacred above the human. Water used in cleansing was often salted or mixed with bitter herbs. Chants were designed to impose rhythm and exhaustion. Gestures of reverence were exaggerated to highlight the devotee's diminished status. Even meals were controlled. Small quantities, specific timing, ritualized preparation, transforming nourishment into a reminder of subservience. Every detail mattered, for it was in the accumulation of these small, relentless pressures that the temple exercised absolute control. Yet, not all expelled devotees succumbed completely. Some developed resilience, learning to navigate the subtle cues of favor, to endure long hours of silent observation, to perform the necessary rituals while maintaining internal defiance. They became adept at appearing compliant while preserving a private sense of self, a quiet resistance hidden beneath layers of ritual obedience. This invisible struggle, however, came at a cost. Their spiritual identity was fractured, their understanding of the divine reshaped by the temple's coercive authority. The power of these temples, therefore, cannot be understood merely by examining their architecture, inscriptions, or public ceremonies. The true influence lay in their capacity to manipulate belief, enforce hierarchy, and extend authority into the mind, body, and social environment of those they expelled. The sacred guardians were not merely protectors of ritual. They were the architects of psychological systems designed to control and redefine human lives. Through this lens, the expulsion of devotees becomes more than a punishment. It becomes a profound testament to the temple's reach, a demonstration of how spiritual institutions wielded subtle, pervasive power over every aspect of existence. It was a silent, invisible force, shaping reality for the expelled, ensuring that obedience, fear, and isolation became as sacred as the rituals themselves, and that the memory of transgression would linger for a lifetime. As the expelled devotees wandered further from the sanctuaries, the guardians' influence remained unbroken, extending into ceremonies hidden from the public eye. These rituals were designed not for communal worship, but for control, for subtle enforcement of hierarchy, and for imposing fear upon those who had dared to defy the temple's edicts. The chambers where these ceremonies were held were often carved deep into the temple's foundations, inaccessible to outsiders, illuminated only by flickering oil lamps and the faint glow of sacred fire. The air was heavy with incense, its aroma mingling with the tension and uncertainty of those present. Every movement, every gesture was scrutinized, and any deviation could trigger a sequence of punishments, escalating from public shaming to prolonged isolation or ritualized penance. The guardians themselves were carefully selected for their unwavering loyalty and keen perception. They were trained to detect hesitation, doubt, or defiance, to interpret subtle shifts in posture, eye movement, or tone of voice as evidence of impurity or rebellion. Expelled devotees were subjected to long hours of observation, sometimes extending through entire nights, as the guardians recorded their actions, marking each perceived infraction. These records were not merely bureaucratic. They served as spiritual verdicts, justifying the continuation or intensification of punishment. The psychological burden of constant surveillance was immense. Every step, every prayer, every act of devotion became a test of endurance, a reflection of the devotee's place within the temple's invisible hierarchy. Beyond surveillance, the ceremonies often included intricate rites of purification, ostensibly designed to cleanse the soul, but effectively reinforcing obedience. Water, ashes, and sacred oils were used in precise sequences. Chants, repeated tirelessly, emphasized submission and reminded the expelled of their diminished standing. In some accounts, devotees were required to repeat mantras that highlighted their failures, their unworthiness, and the impossibility of regaining favor. The guardians understood that repetition and ritualized stress created a psychological framework that could erode confidence, instill doubt, and condition compliance over time. The effects of these hidden rituals were profound. Expelled devotees reported a sense of being trapped between the mortal and divine, their spiritual identity both questioned and reconstructed by the guardians' manipulations. Social reintegration became nearly impossible as the temple's authority extended into local communities. Families and peers were often complicit, reinforcing the narrative of spiritual failure and ensuring that the expulsion's consequences extended far beyond the temple's walls. The spiritual exile became a lifelong condition, and the expelled were forced to navigate a world where their devotion was simultaneously expected and condemned. These ceremonies also created a chilling paradox. The very people who had devoted their lives to sacred service were now instruments in the temple's demonstration of power. The expelled were transformed into living reminders of the consequences of disobedience, examples of divine justice enforced by human hands. Their suffering served as both punishment and lesson, a cautionary tale whispered through generations. Now, consider the weight of these hidden rites. Imagine the psychological toll of years spent under constant observation, performing rituals that simultaneously honored and humiliated, cleansing yet condemning. The sacred guardians orchestrated this with precision, ensuring that each devotee understood the cost of transgression. At this point, I want to hear from you. How do you think you would have survived in such an environment? Could you maintain your faith under relentless scrutiny, or would the fear and isolation have broken you? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share your perspective on what it means to face spiritual authority wielded with such exacting control. Your insights are vital to understanding the human side of these ancient practices. The expulsion did not merely remove devotees from the temple, it redefined their existence, embedding a mark of spiritual exile that could never be fully erased. Once severed from the inner sanctum, their lives were dominated by the shadow of the temple's judgment. Communities that once embraced them now regarded them with caution or fear, as if proximity to the expelled could carry divine contamination. They became wanderers of faith, carrying a reputation both feared and incomprehensible. Navigating landscapes where sacred and social hierarchies converged to reinforce isolation. The guardians had succeeded not only in expulsion, but in transforming the social reality around the individual, a testament to the profound reach of spiritual authority in the ancient world. Devotees often found themselves directed toward peripheral sacred sites, remote shrines, and secondary temples where rituals were performed under extreme conditions. These journeys were framed as pilgrimages of atonement, but in reality, they were exercises in endurance and submission. Harsh terrains, minimal provisions, and relentless schedules compounded the sense of vulnerability. Every step, every prayer performed under scrutiny reinforced the idea that their survival depended entirely on adherence to the temple's invisible rules. These rites were not designed to nurture, but to enforce obedience through adversity, conditioning the expelled to internalize the temple's dominance as an unchallengeable truth. Even within these peripheral sites, the presence of guardians or intermediaries ensured that compliance was never optional. The expelled were monitored continuously, their adherence to ritual precision evaluated, and any deviation could trigger further punishment or extension of exile. Fasting, repetitive recitation of sacred texts, and prolonged periods of meditation were tools used not for enlightenment, but for control, producing a psychological landscape where the devotees' autonomy was systematically eroded. Their devotion became a mechanism of subjugation, a cruel inversion of the spiritual purpose they once pursued with sincerity and zeal. This manipulation extended into social and familial networks as well. Families were often coerced to participate in ceremonies that reinforced the expelled's subservience, creating layers of accountability beyond the temple itself. Supportive friends risked censure, loss of favor, or exclusion from religious functions. By embedding authority within the community, the temple ensured that exile carried a persistent social stigma, magnifying the psychological impact of ritualized punishment. The expelled became symbols of the consequences of transgression, their suffering a perpetual reminder to others of the temple's control. Yet, amidst this extreme marginalization, some devotees discovered subtle forms of resistance. Small acts of silent prayer, private meditation, or clandestine gatherings allowed them to preserve a fragment of autonomy and spiritual identity. These gestures, invisible to the guardians, were essential to survival, maintaining a sense of self even under the relentless weight of ritualized control. The expelled learned to navigate a precarious balance: outward compliance, internal defiance, and the careful management of appearances to avoid additional sanctions. The exile ritual, therefore, was not merely a punishment, it was a transformation. The expelled were stripped of prior status, subjected to rigorous tests of endurance, and forced to confront a reality where their fate was dictated by unseen authority. The process created individuals whose lives were forever altered, their spiritual and social identities reframed by the temple's hidden mechanisms. They became living embodiments of obedience, fear, and resilience, a testament to the complex interplay of power, faith, and human psychology within the sacred spaces of ancient Hindu temples. Within the hidden corridors of the temples, judgment did not stop at exile or ritualized suffering. The inner sanctum held chambers where secret tribunals were conducted, accessible only to the high priests and select guardians. These tribunals were not public hearings, nor did they follow any conventional notion of justice. Instead, they were meticulously orchestrated assessments of devotion, obedience, and perceived purity. The expelled devotees were summoned, often without warning, and placed before a council whose authority was absolute. Every gesture, every word, every hesitation was scrutinized, interpreted as evidence of either submission or defiance. The tribunals operated under a logic that fused spiritual doctrine with psychological control. Questions were framed to expose doubt, rituals were structured to reveal weakness, and even silence could be construed as rebellion. The expelled were compelled to recite complex chants or perform intricate gestures, and failure, real or perceived, invited extended periods of deprivation or intensified ritual penance. Guardians documented these proceedings with exacting detail, recording every failure, every misstep, and every hint of insubordination. These records were both administrative and spiritual instruments, reinforcing the temple's power over the expelled and creating a permanent archive of compliance or failure. Punishments within these tribunals were varied and calculated. Some involved prolonged meditation in uncomfortable positions, designed to test both physical endurance and mental focus. Others, required the devotee to witness sacred objects they could no longer touch, reinforcing the separation between favor and expulsion. In extreme cases, symbolic acts of humiliation were employed, such as wearing markers or insignias that indicated spiritual impurity. These markers were visible to other devotees who had not been expelled, serving as a constant reminder of the hierarchy and the consequences of transgression. The psychological impact of the tribunals was profound. Expelled devotees internalized the authority of the guardians, often interpreting judgment as divine will. The lines between divine retribution and human enforcement blurred, and fear became an inseparable element of devotion. This manipulation extended beyond the temple, influencing the behavior of communities and families. Even distant relatives could be subtly coerced into observing or reinforcing the outcome of a tribunal, further isolating the expelled and ensuring the permanence of the temple's control. Despite the oppressive weight of these tribunals, some expelled devotees developed strategies to endure and preserve a sense of self. They learned to anticipate the guardian's expectations, to perform rituals with precision while protecting private thoughts, and to navigate the invisible boundaries between compliance and defiance. This delicate balance required acute awareness and resilience, as a single misstep could prolong suffering or result in additional penalties. The tribunals, therefore, functioned as both instruments of punishment and tests of adaptability, shaping the character of those subjected to them in ways that were often invisible to the uninitiated. Through these secret assessments, the temple maintained its power, ensuring that even beyond exile, the expelled remained under its influence. Spiritual identity, social standing, and personal autonomy were all subjected to meticulous evaluation and control. The high priests and guardians leveraged their authority not merely to punish, but to condition the mind, to transform fear into compliance, and to extend the reach of sacred power far beyond the visible temple walls. It was within these hidden chambers, through continuous observation, ritualized interrogation, and precise psychological manipulation, that the expelled devotees learned the harshest lesson. In the ancient temples, divine authority was inseparable from human enforcement, and to navigate the consequences of expulsion required endurance, intelligence, and a quiet, private resistance that could never be documented by the guardians themselves. As expelled devotees continued their journey, the influence of the temple remained omnipresent, extending into the rituals and practices that governed their daily existence. These ceremonies were not meant for public display. They were carefully orchestrated exercises in obedience and psychological conditioning, designed to remind the expelled of the temple's unyielding authority. Guardians and high priests observed from the shadows, ensuring that every gesture, every word, and every thought aligned with expectations, transforming devotion into a subtle form of control. The expelled were never allowed to forget their position, constantly confronted by the knowledge that their every action was being evaluated. Within the temple's hidden spaces, the ceremonies grew increasingly intricate. Devotees were subjected to sequences of ritualized fasting, extended periods of silent meditation, and the repetitive recitation of mantras that emphasized humility and submission. The expelled were made to chant for the prosperity of those still within the sanctum, a cruel inversion of faith that reinforced their isolation while maintaining their engagement with sacred duties. The guardians monitored each movement, noting lapses in concentration, hesitation in gestures, or deviations from ritual precision. These observations were meticulously recorded, creating a permanent archive of compliance or failure that determined the severity of future rites. The psychological impact was profound. By controlling the rhythm of devotion, The temple shaped the thoughts and behaviors of the expelled, enforcing obedience through both spiritual and social mechanisms. Families and communities were often complicit, subtly reinforcing the consequences of expulsion. Any attempt at assistance or dissent risked retribution, ensuring that the expelled remained isolated and dependent on the temple's judgment. This combination of surveillance, ritual, and social control created an environment where fear and reverence became inseparable, and where survival required careful navigation of every action, every thought, and every word. Yet, within this system of relentless control, small acts of resistance emerged. Some expelled devotees developed private rituals or internalized prayers, preserving fragments of personal faith and identity hidden from the guardian's view. Others memorized sacred chants or gestures with precision, maintaining the illusion of obedience while quietly asserting their autonomy. These private acts of defiance were essential for psychological survival, offering a means of retaining selfhood in a world designed to erase it. The temple's authority, while formidable, could not entirely extinguish the inner resilience of those it sought to dominate. The ceremonies themselves often included extreme forms of symbolic penance. Devotees were required to carry ritual objects, recite prayers in uncomfortable positions, or endure prolonged exposure to elements while maintaining focus and composure. Every hardship was framed as a divine test, reinforcing the idea that failure was not merely personal, but spiritual. Through this carefully engineered environment, the temple cultivated a system in which obedience, endurance, and internalized fear were inseparable, shaping the mind and spirit as meticulously as any physical ritual shaped the body. Now, I want to hear from you. How would you have survived under such relentless scrutiny and ritualized control? Could you maintain your faith and identity while every gesture was monitored and every thought judged? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. Your perspective matters, and engaging in this conversation helps illuminate the human experience behind these ancient practices. Let me know what you think about the hidden power these temples exercised, and how fear and devotion intertwined to shape lives in ways few outsiders could ever understand. As the expelled devotees moved further from the temple's inner sanctum, they encountered the hidden mechanisms of spiritual enforcement that had been carefully cultivated over centuries. The guardian's authority extended beyond walls and rituals into the very perception of the sacred, creating an environment in which the expelled were forced to navigate invisible hierarchies and unspoken expectations. Every path taken, every prayer recited, was subtly dictated by the temple's unseen oversight, transforming what might appear to be freedom into a continuation of the controlled obedience imposed within the sanctum. The spatial separation from the temple did not imply liberation. Rather, it reinforced the enduring power of sacred authority, conditioning the mind to perceive itself as perpetually observed and evaluated. Along the remote pilgrimage routes, the expelled were subjected to a series of practices that combined spiritual discipline with psychological coercion. Devotees were instructed to perform arduous journeys while carrying sacred objects they could no longer touch within the sanctum, to recite chants for blessings that had been withdrawn, and to meditate in isolation under conditions of deprivation. These practices, though outwardly framed as acts of devotion, were in reality exercises designed to reinforce the temple's supremacy. By imposing physical and mental hardship, simultaneously, the guardians ensured that the expelled internalized the consequences of transgression as a permanent condition, shaping both behavior and belief to align with the temple's authority. Symbolic acts of subjugation were woven into daily routines. The expelled might be required to kneel in reverence at distant shrines, performing gestures of humility while under scrutiny from guardians positioned strategically along their path. Meals were strictly regulated, often incorporating fasting periods that tested endurance while maintaining the illusion of spiritual merit. Water, food, and sacred offerings were used as instruments of control, each element reinforcing a hierarchy in which the expelled occupied the lowest tier. The subtlety of these practices allowed the temple to maintain influence without overt confrontation, ensuring that psychological and spiritual conditioning occurred continuously, shaping identity as effectively as any formal ritual within the sanctuary. Throughout this period, social enforcement complemented spiritual oversight. Local communities, aware of the temple's reach and invested in its authority, often participated in reinforcing the exile of the expelled. Assistance from family or peers could be met with censure, social exclusion, or indirect punishment, amplifying the consequences of expulsion. This integration of social dynamics into the temple's mechanisms ensured that isolation and fear were not merely symbolic, but tangible, forces that shaped every interaction and decision of the expelled devotee. Despite these extreme measures, some expelled individuals adapted strategies of resilience. They cultivated private rituals, memorized sacred texts with precision, or engaged in subtle internal acts of devotion that remained invisible to the guardians. These adaptive behaviors allowed them to retain a sense of spiritual identity while outwardly appearing compliant, navigating a world in which obedience was continuously demanded and monitored. Such resilience highlights the complex interplay between power, faith, and human ingenuity, demonstrating that even under pervasive authority, the human spirit found ways to endure. The experience of the expelled demonstrates the temple's extraordinary capacity for influence. It was not simply the architecture or the public rituals that commanded obedience, but the carefully engineered combination of spiritual, psychological, and social mechanisms. Through these layers, the guardians shaped the actions, beliefs, and perceptions of those who were no longer welcome, ensuring that the reach of sacred authority extended far beyond the walls of the sanctum and into the very consciousness of the devotees who had once devoted their lives to the divine. As time passed, the expelled devotees became acutely aware that their punishment was not only spiritual, but existential. The temple's hidden authority extended into every facet of life, shaping their routines, their choices, and even their perceptions of reality. What they had once considered acts of devotion were now instruments of control, carefully orchestrated to reinforce submission and compliance. Each pilgrimage, each chant, and each gesture was a reminder that the temple's power did not end with expulsion, but continued to govern their existence through subtle mechanisms of observation and expectation. The invisible presence of the sacred guardians imposed a constant tension, ensuring that fear and reverence remained inseparable in the minds of the expelled. Even in remote areas far from the temple, the expelled were constantly reminded of the hierarchy they had violated. Secondary shrines, peripheral temples, and minor sanctuaries functioned as checkpoints for ritualized evaluation. Devotees were expected to demonstrate unwavering adherence to prescribed practices, and any deviation, intentional or accidental, was interpreted as evidence of defiance or impurity. Guardians or emissaries could appear unexpectedly to observe, test, or correct, reinforcing the notion that divine oversight was omnipresent. Through this continuous enforcement, the temple extended its influence into spaces where devotees might have otherwise believed themselves free, blurring the lines between spiritual service and coercion. The psychological effects were profound. The expelled internalized the temple's judgment, perceiving their every action as a potential infraction. This internalized surveillance created a state of heightened awareness, where thought, speech, and movement were constantly monitored by the mind itself, a reflection of the guardian's invisible authority. The expulsion thus became not merely a separation from the sanctum, but a perpetual exercise in self-regulation, ensuring that even in absence, the temple's doctrines dictated behavior. The devotee's identity, once shaped by personal devotion and community recognition, was now redefined by a constant negotiation with fear, expectation, and the need for survival. Physical hardship was interwoven with spiritual conditioning. Long journeys to distant sites tested endurance. Fasting cycles pushed limits. Ritualized labor imposed both obedience and physical strain. These hardships were justified as spiritual trials, but their cumulative effect was to reinforce the power imbalance between the temple and the expelled. Social networks often mirrored these pressures, as families and communities enforced compliance, monitored behavior, or subtly shunned the expelled, amplifying the isolation and reinforcing the consequences of transgression. Survival became a skill in navigating both physical and social landscapes, demanding acute awareness, adaptability, and restraint. Yet even within this rigidly controlled environment, subtle forms of resistance persisted. Expelled devotees found ways to maintain private rituals, memorized sacred texts, or cultivated inner practices that were invisible to the guardians. These acts allowed for the preservation of personal faith and identity, demonstrating that even under the most pervasive systems of authority, the human spirit could retain autonomy, however hidden. The interplay of fear, obedience, and resilience defined the daily existence of the expelled, revealing the temple's ability to shape not only external behaviors, but the very fabric of consciousness and perception. Through centuries, the expulsion rituals and ongoing oversight ensured that obedience, fear, and spiritual hierarchy remained intertwined. The expelled were forced to navigate a world where survival depended upon compliance, adaptation, and the maintenance of an inner life that could not be fully observed. The sacred guardian's influence reached beyond the visible, embedding itself in the psyche of those once devoted, creating a legacy of control, endurance, and psychological transformation that defined the experience of exile for generations. The fate of the expelled devotees ultimately revealed the full extent of the temple's hidden authority. As they navigated the margins of sacred and social spaces, their experiences became living testimonies to a system that had been meticulously constructed to assert control, maintain hierarchy, and enforce obedience. The guardian's influence, initially subtle, revealed itself as a continuous force shaping every thought, gesture, and interaction. Even in exile, the expelled were caught within a web of surveillance, ritual obligation, and social expectation, where the line between spiritual guidance and coercion was deliberately blurred. The temple's reach extended far beyond the sanctum, shaping lives through the unseen mechanisms of authority, endurance, and psychological conditioning. Through years of observation, ritualized hardship, and social isolation, the expelled internalized the lessons intended by the guardians. Every step taken on pilgrimages, every chant performed in private, and every act of outward obedience was informed by the omnipresent awareness of judgment. Yet within this carefully orchestrated system of control, the human spirit found ways to endure, to preserve fragments of personal identity, and to assert private devotion. These acts of resilience, hidden from the guardian's eyes, became the quiet rebellion of the expelled, a testament to the capacity for inner strength and spiritual defiance even under relentless authority. The broader impact of these practices cannot be underestimated. The expelled served as living reminders to those still within the temple walls of the consequences of transgression. Their suffering was observed, remembered, and internalized by others, reinforcing the hierarchy and perpetuating the guardian's influence. Social networks, families, and peripheral communities all became participants in the enforcement of sacred authority, demonstrating how the temple's power extended beyond ritual and architecture into every dimension of life. Even those who were physically removed from the sanctum carried the invisible weight of the temple's judgment, shaping behavior and thought in ways that were profound and enduring. Yet this narrative is not one of total despair. The expelled demonstrated adaptability, cunning, and resilience, preserving private rituals, memorized chants, and personal devotion even as they performed the outward signs of compliance. In doing so, they challenged the temple's monopoly over spiritual authority, illustrating that while structures of power can shape and constrain, they cannot entirely eradicate the human capacity for independent thought, belief, and perseverance. This subtle resistance became an essential element of survival, a hidden testament to the power of the spirit under duress. Now, if you've followed the journey of these expelled devotees, you understand the depth and subtlety of the temple's influence, the relentless oversight of the sacred guardians, and the quiet, yet profound, ways in which human resilience manifested. If this story has given you insight into the complexities of spiritual authority and the endurance of the human spirit, I encourage you to engage with the channel. Make sure to subscribe so you can continue exploring hidden truths. Leave a comment telling us, "I stayed to the end," to show you reached this far, and share your reflections. And of course, like the video if it helped you uncover the secrets behind these ancient practices. There's another video waiting that delves even deeper into hidden rituals and sacred hierarchies. Click and continue exploring with me to uncover more of the mysteries that history tried to hide.